This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Today, my guest is Andrew Ross Sorkin, who is a co-host of CNBC's Squawk Box and the founder and editor-at-large of DealBook at the New York Times, where he's also a columnist. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew, and
Thank-
welcome to the Capitalism and Freedom podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. This is going to be fun.
Well, I've been a huge fan of yours for a long time, and like many others, watch Squawk Box very routinely. I just want to, start by asking a simple question. I mean, how do you get up in the morning in time to do a 6 a.m. show on the East Coast every single day? I mean, what time do you wake up? What time do you go to bed? I mean, are you going to bed
Oh
at 4
boy. Oh
p.m.
boy.
or
I try to be awake by call it 4:30, 4:25, 4:30, which by the way is late in TV morning land. My colleague Becky Quick gets up, I believe, maybe even an hour earlier than I do, 3:30 maybe. I live happily just about 15 minutes, even less, 10 minutes from the studio, so I can race there. I do the makeup like I'm an F1 driver or doing NASCAR or something as quickly as humanly possible. I try to go to sleep. I'd say I want to be asleep by 9 or 9:30.
wow?
That would be ideal. But I'd probably say, once or twice a week, I sort of push 10. If I go to sleep after 10, it's not a good situation.
It's amazing. I mean, it's such discipline, because I'm sure you have to leave dinner parties early
Oh
and
yeah,
so
no. By
forth.
the way, great excuse to leave a dinner party or cocktail party if you just say, I always say it's a school night, guys. I gotta go. And people seem because they can see that you're on TV the next day. People seem to think that's socially an acceptable way
Yeah.
to walk out. I do have to admit that definitely Sunday nights and maybe sometimes during the week, I have to take melatonin to go to sleep at that hour, meaning to like get to sleep because sometimes I mean, I don't take anything else, but sometimes it's hard, especially if you get off if you end up staying up till 10 or 11 o'clock on a Friday or Saturday night. I find Sunday night trying to get back in bed at the right time is it's like, you know, a little jet lag-ish.
It's amazing and just, I mean, incredible discipline. I mean, one other story that I've heard that's sort of a bit like that is my understanding is that Tom Sowell would, even without having a 6 a.m. TV show, he would just routinely basically get up at a dinner party at like 9 or 10 p.m. Or sorry, at like 9 p.m. I think it was, and would just go home. It could be in the middle of some great conversation, but he was very disciplined about going to bed at early every day. And I mean, he'd written 40 books, and his incredible, super influential career. Like yourself. So maybe that's the secret. We just all need to be going to bed much earlier. And
I'm not going to out him. I know a very famous CEO, chairman of a publicly traded company, who I think literally, because I've been at meals and places where like 8:15 rolls around, and this guy just gets up out of his chair and walks out, and almost just doesn't care. So maybe, you know,
amazing. Maybe that's the secret.
I
Uh,
don't, I don't think anything interesting happens late at night, but I know a lot of people tell me that a lot of interesting things happen late at night, and clearly I'm sleeping. So what do I know?
well, that's too good. Well, I just you getting into your career a little bit. Growing up, I mean, did you see yourself? Do you imagine yourself becoming a journalist? I mean, was there maybe a specific moment where you realized that was going to be the path for you, and particularly also doing covering finance and being in the heart
So
of Wall Street?
absolutely not. Like 1,000% not. I had no interest in being a journalist. I find writing very hard. Like even today, I still write books. I do write articles every day. I don't play the computer keyboard like a piano. I sit there and I'm hunting and I'm pecking and I'm in pain and all the things. So I never thought I'd be a writer ever. And I wanted to be in business. I thought of myself a bit as an entrepreneur. I still do in some respects. But when I was 15 years old, I started a sports magazine, not because I was interested in the journalistic aspect of it per se, but I was interested in sports, and I thought there was an opportunity to sell a lot of advertising actually around the magazine at the time, and I went off and tried to turn the magazine into a national magazine. It ultimately actually failed by the time I was 18, but it gave me an opportunity to get my foot in the door as an intern, sort of a pseudo intern, unofficial intern at the New York Times when I was in high school. And there was a woman there who was an editor who had no idea how old I was. I was in the building. I think I had my suit on. I think I was wearing a tie. She thought I was a college graduate who, was like a news clerk or something. She overheard me talking about this thing called the internet in 1995, and she assigned me a story to write. And I went off and I wrote the article. And the truth is, I thought it was like a one summer, that never again situation. And then I just kept doing it. And I fell in love with it because I do love business. I really thought I'd ultimately, go to business school after college or something like that, or maybe law school. But I always thought if you could follow the money, it explained everything. And I don't say that cynically. I mean, but it explained not just business, it explained politics, it explained sports, it explained parts of the worlds of art, everything. And so I just became enamored with it. And I'm also just fascinated by the characters, the people, and the motivations and incentives that people have and why people do what they do. And that's really has led so much of what's turned out to be a career in journalism.
It's amazing. And just I guess the entrepreneurial mindset, I'm very much impressed by. I mean, you started DealBook. I mean, like what was when did that idea hit you that that there wasn't good enough business coverage out there and that you could do this?
Well, so I'll tell you what was going on. I was working at the New York Times. I had graduated from Cornell University. I had been at the London School of Economics my junior year, part of my junior year, and I'd covered business for the New York Times based in London. So when I graduated, they sent me back to London. This is the top of the M&A boom. It was late 90s. Everything was booming. It was unbelievable. I moved back to New York. This is now end of 2000, 2001. And I'm thinking, oh, this job should be a lot easier based in New York because the New York Times is based in New York. And so all the bankers and lawyers and people are going to read the Times. And a lot of them, I'd go around and meet different people in the business and they'd say, Sorkin, you seem like a nice kid, but we get the Times at home. We read the front page, we read the sports page, and then I take the Wall Street Journal with me on the subway to work. Dagger to the heart. So this was, and I'm thinking, oh goodness, how am I going to get in front of these people? Super important that we have, super competitive coverage. And I actually thought a lot of our coverage was really competitive. They just weren't seeing it. And so I had this thought, well, what happens if we sort of just go straight to their inbox? And this was way before, Politico and Playbook or Axios or Semaphore, I mean, this is before, frankly, blogs. The idea of even linking to somebody else's website, to another news organization's website, was almost anathema at the time.
Wow.
So, but I thought I'm spending an extraordinary amount of time running around the internet looking for stuff. Other people are doing the same. If I could put all in one place for people, that would be a valuable service, and we could try to get some advertisers to advertise against it, and ultimately, hopefully, the audience would be a valuable one. And it was really built originally. I remember the Times, I think, told me they thought there was really an audience of only maybe 30,000 people for this product. They didn't use the phrase TAM, but maybe today you'd say TAM. And we had, I don't know, within maybe 3 months, we had like 80,000 people reading. People would be emailing me, trying to get on the list. I remember used to get CEOs would call me up, CEOs, secretaries would call me up and say, "Can you fax us DealBook? We don't use email." And so, and that's how it began.
Wow.
25 years later.
That's amazing. I'm so ahead of the curve, and it's still hitting inboxes every day and multiple times every day. I mean, it's amazing. It's a great newsletter. I read it.
Thank you.
Many people read it. And I think it is very much
We're,
the
our,
gold
our
standard.
our TAM is a much bigger now. I think well, 1 million plus people read it every day, so it's a lot different.
So I guess then from there, how did you also someone to doing video journalism? How did you someone to TV and CNBC?
Oh, so the truth is, I was writing lots of different articles trying to break news of different mergers and deals, and there was a period of time where I was covering actually a lot of the deal folks got into trouble, so I was covering white collar crime, and a lot of the articles I was writing, I would get calls from bookers at the different TV shows. They'd call me up and say, "Could you come talk about your article?" I used to go, I was covering the Martha Stewart trial. I'd go on the Today Show with Katie Couric and Matt Lauer back in the day, or on Charlie Rose or one of these programs, and then onto CNBC. And I would, come on as a guest expert, if you will, about a particular topic, deals or what have you. And then in 2011, I was going on TV probably more, especially around the financial crisis. I'd written this book, Too Big to Fail. And then in 2011, they were reshifting a little bit around what Squawk Box looked like and what the show Squawk on the Street looked like. And they were Carl Quintanilla, who's a great friend, who was one of the three hosts of Squawk Box. They were going to move to Squawk on the Street to try to create some continuity between the two shows. And they called me up and they said, "Hey, would you want to host a TV show?" And I said, "Are you crazy?" I mean, I didn't even know how to, I still don't really know very well how to read a teleprompter, but that's how it began. So I added that to my list of activities, and it's been great in so many ways.
It's amazing, and also, Squawk Box is certainly the gold standard for just the guests that you have and the conversations that go on there. It's really amazing just over the years. I can remember just so many, there's too many guests to be able to remember, but just so many key moments that key conversations that have happened just in those few hours in the morning. Now, like, I want to get into books, and so, like,
Yeah.
you know obviously 2008 was a hugely formative event, I think, for everyone who was around at that time, and certainly working Wall Street. And so, I mean, even just mom and pops, on Main Street, hugely affected. Those who lost their jobs, those who saw their 401ks get devastated. What was the moment that told you that you were going to write the definitive account of the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, first of all, I never knew that I was going to write the definitive account of the financial crisis. What happened was I was working, as you might imagine, the weekend that the Lehman Brothers was filing for bankruptcy, and Bank of America was buying Merrill Lynch, and AIG was teetering, and I worked that weekend back then, by the way, everyone was in the office all the time. I mean, usually till midnight. And I remember that Sunday night, I worked the whole day like crazy, working the phones, writing like crazy. I wrote the front page article for the paper with several of my colleagues. And I remember going home, must have been 1, 2 in the morning. And I remember waking up my wife and telling her all of the things that had happened because I couldn't believe it. And I remember saying to her, "It's like a movie." I mean, I couldn't, it was almost like the world felt like it was going to fall off its axis. I mean, I couldn't even sort of contemplate what was happening. It felt so momentous. And she looked at me and she said, "No, Andrew, it's like a book." And we ultimately got a movie out of it too, but that's really what led me to write the book. I'd been thinking of wanting to. I'd always wanted to try my hand at writing a book, but it never felt like I knew what the subject was that would really sort of captivate my own curiosity and interest and hold my interest for what I knew had to be a long period of time. Everybody I knew who ever wrote a book said you got to fall in love with the story or the characters because otherwise you're going to be doing this for a year or two or whatever it is. Um, and then I spent the next year basically in a race because a lot of other journalists were also writing books about this. So it wasn't just, I didn't have my own lane, and I worked flat out for about a year, and then the book came out.
Right. Well, and I guess, through your other, roles in CNBC and New York Times, you had access to people. I'm sure, you were able to talk to people that others couldn't.
So it's funny. I wasn't hosting on CNBC. I was going on CNBC a little bit. I didn't know all of the main players before this
Mm.
began. I knew a lot of bankers and lawyers and people who were involved in it, but not everybody. And what I found though was that there was sort of an 80-20 rule to reporting. If I could get 80% of the way there, meaning if I could get enough people to tell me certain things, I could then go to other people who didn't necessarily either know me or want to talk to me, and by the way, there were people who either didn't want to talk to me or for legal reasons. There was all sorts of, um, civil cases taking place. There was, I think, anxiety about criminal cases at that time, if you recall. And
Absolutely.
so oftentimes it was sort of learning about certain pieces of information or sort of understanding a scene or a moment and then being able to call somebody who maybe I didn't know and say, "Look, I know you don't want to talk to me, or I know we've never met, but here's what I have." And so I just want you to understand where I am. And I often found that they were, I don't know if I would say impressed enough by that, but some of them thought, "Okay, you know what? I should probably talk to this guy." Um, Some of them did it for the right reasons. They really believed in the history and they wanted to be right. I know people who frankly did it for the wrong reasons. They won't, they wanted to spin or rewrite history, or they were trying to screw over somebody or the other. And then I think there was this other group that probably did it even if they didn't want, spoke to me ultimately, even if they didn't want to, in part because they felt, that they needed to, given that so many other people were talking.
It's amazing and really an amazing just these narrative accounts are just like just following people and what they say and those sorts of I think that narrative nonfiction I think is just so great in the sense that really takes you there and almost makes you feel like you're in the room for for these huge events.
Well, I was going to say my favorite books. I don't know about you. I always loved, Barbarians at the Gate, which was about the RJR Nabisco takeover in the 80s. Den of Thieves to me was one of the great business books that I always loved. I loved Liar's Poker. I love those books
Why
that
Genius
made
Failed. I mean
Why
that
Genius Failed by Roger
LTCM.
by Roger Lowenstein. There were so many of these books that brought you in the room that made you feel like you were there and made you not just think about it in the sort of systemic, sort of in fully economic terms, but in people terms. Because to me, ultimately, it's the people that make decisions that ultimately lead to some of these systems and economic cycles and things. So that sort of was always my North Star.
Absolutely. And so, you wrote this first book in 2008. You've written a second book, 1929, and this takes readers back to the original massive financial collapse where the stock market fell by about 90% from 1929 to 1932. In 2008, we saw the market sell off by almost 50%, by going by the S&P 500. I'm just curious, what made you want to return to that moment? I'm sure you could write on all sorts of things happening now. I mean, AI, COVID, lots of things that are happening that are very interesting. I'm very impressed that one, you've written this great account of history. It's nearly 100 years ago, and it's at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. I can't remember a time where there's been a great history book that's had some staying power in the New York Times bestseller list. I think nowadays, memoirs are very popular,
Right.
self-help books are very popular, but like true, history sort of written well, it's fantastic to see it doing well. But what made you want to write another book in particular
Well,
about
thank you.
1929?
First of all, I had no idea whether it would do as well as it has, and it's knock on wood, it's just extraordinary. But maybe I need to thank my wife again. We went on vacation probably about a decade ago, and so many people had actually asked me, about 1929, comparing it to 2008, and after writing Too Big to Fail, they thought I would probably know a lot about 1929, and the truth is that I didn't. And
Oh,
so, I mean, I'd read the old Galbraith book, years ago in college, I think, but I didn't feel steeped in that period. And so I went on this vacation and I brought all these books with me and I downloaded books to my Kindle to try to read about this period. And there's some extraordinary and very, very interesting books about this period. But I remember saying to my wife, kind of, I think on the flight home, for some reason, there's not one of these kind of like Barbarians at the Gate version books. There's not a Too Big to Fail version of 1929 that really makes you feel like you understand who these people are and what they're actually saying to each other. A lot of them were written by economists, or sort of a different writing style back then. I thought, well, is there enough information? It may be that there's not, the detail, the sort of granular detail that you need to be able to, capture a conversation. Where are you going to get the quotes? How could you make a book like this? Could it even be possible? And I happened maybe about 6 months later to be up at Harvard University. I was supposed to give a lecture and I got there early. And I happened to walk into Baker Library and I asked the archivist there if I could look at some of the boxes of Thomas Lamont's papers. And Thomas Lamont was the fellow who effectively was running JP Morgan during this period. And I'd asked for some of the boxes from 29, I think, and 30. And as I'm going through these papers, I realized that he was keeping these extraordinary diaries. His secretary would keep notes and sometimes even transcripts from these meetings and phone calls he was having with Hoover and Roosevelt. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, this is amazing. This is how you could actually craft a book like this? And I remember going back to the archivist and I was explaining to her what I wanted to do. And she looked at me and she said, "Ah, I don't think you can do that." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, Thomas Lamont kept great records. Most of the other people probably didn't. And there's not one or two or three archives that you're going to just be able to go find to go do this." And I sort of took that as a as a personal challenge, and then spent the next basically 8 years finding. And she was right. I mean, this is required ultimately dozens of archives, meeting family members of certain people,
Wow.
getting depositions and diaries and notes and letters from all sorts of very, places that I never really imagined I'd have to go. And then I got very lucky, which is I had been realized that the New York Federal Reserve Board had never released the board minutes from those meetings. For whatever
Hmm.
reason, 100 years later, the current board minutes, by the way, they're released on the website. You can go. 1929, the board minutes never existed. I mean, they never made them public. And
This is
so
like George Harrison, Ben Strong, that those folks were
exactly,
in charge at the
exactly
time.
that period. And I thought, but also so many of my main characters were on the board of the New York Fed. So
Hmm.
Thomas Lamont, Charles Mitchell,
Hmm. Head of the City National Bank at the time.
who was head of the National City, which becomes Citigroup. He was really the sort of the leader of the largest bank in the country at that moment. And so I got the New York Fed to release these minutes to me. And once I had those minutes, and you don't really necessarily, hopefully, you don't actually feel them in the book, but it became a sort of treasure map for me in terms of where else to go figure out, who they might have been talking to then, and sort of to put timestamps on things. And it really was extraordinary in terms of just what it did to the research process. In fact, interestingly, when they first sent me the minutes, they had actually had a lawyer go back and redact all sorts of information. I thought, what redact? What are you redacting? It's 100 years later. So anyway, that was sort of the research process. But ultimately, it was really about reconstructing these scenes, using these notes and letters and things, and oftentimes pictures, descriptions of rooms, architecture plans, all sorts of things like that.
That's amazing. So I'm just curious, like, what were some of the favorite stories or people that you learned about, working on 1929 and writing it into the book?
Oh goodness, I am so enamored by one person in particular, John Raskob, who I think may be the Elon Musk of his era. John Raskob ran General Motors in the early 1900s, and uniquely and maybe importantly, really changed the culture around credit and debt in America. So prior to basically 1919, it was sort of considered a moral sin to take on a loan. People didn't even want to take on a mortgage. It was just something proper people did not do. And John Raskob, 1919, is thinking to himself, he's running General Motors at the time. He thinks, how am I going to sell more cars? There's not enough people who have enough money to buy cars from us. So he says, we're going to loan them the money to buy the cars. This was the original sort of vendor financing, uh, customer financing kind of vehicle that GM starts. And it was that shift and that thinking actually that changed everything because then you had Sears Roebuck start to loan people money to buy appliances. And then you had Wall Street, Charlie Mitchell from National City start to do the same so that people could buy stock using margin. But then John Raskob becomes an extraordinarily wealthy and successful investor. Then, like Elon, he gets involved in politics, ends up actually choosing the wrong candidate. He supported Al Smith. By the way, Al Smith was a Democrat. He was really a Republican. He sort of switches just to get in with him to some degree. And then when he loses, he goes on a sort of secret campaign to really try to change the reputation, undermine the reputation of Hoover. I mean, I can't imagine what John Raskob would have been like with Twitter. It would have been unbelievable. But then John Raskob builds what is the equivalent of probably SpaceX back then. He builds the Empire State Building with his own money, no debt, interestingly enough.
Wow.
At one point, he creates what might have been considered one of the first mutual funds in history. And then, most uniquely, he writes an essay in the fall of 1929, long forgotten, because he was considered a little bit of a philosopher king. Everybody journalists would listen to every word. They'd hang on every word of his that he would talk about. He wrote this essay suggesting that America needed to have a 5-day work week instead of a 6-day work week. So back then, there was we all worked on most people worked on Saturdays. The stock market was open on Saturdays, but it wasn't because he was a nice guy. His view was that he wanted to create a bigger consumer economy, and that if you had two weekend days, more people would buy cars because they had time to go places. They'd buy different outfits. They would do things to their home, all sorts of things like that. And he suggested at the time that all federal holidays should fall on a Monday, except for Christmas, so that you could get a 3-day weekend to create even more consumerism. And so I always thought that John Raskob was just this sort of strangely interesting, uniquely fascinating character that a lot of people don't talk about today, but I think had a profound impact on America.
We should be thanking him for 3-day weekends, I guess, at some level. I mean, that's amazing. And yeah, I didn't even realize that the stock market was open on Saturdays. I mean, it's yeah, it's such a fascinating time. And I want to, I guess, walk through a little bit, I guess, some of the narrative at the time. And obviously, my understanding, and having read the book, a lot of these stock market losses, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, I think Black Thursday, that's
Yes.
all happening in October
Hmm.
seems like all these financial crises always happen in the autumn for some reason. But that was really a key point, and a huge breaking point. But I'm just curious, sort of in the lead up to all this, we have, there was the panic of 1907 where,
Hmm.
the stock market crashed and JP Morgan bailed out Wall Street. But then we had the creation of the Federal Reserve in part in response to that to sort of fill the role that JP Morgan had played as a lender of last resort. But at some level, they're, the New York Fed, I think they did use the discount window a bit during this time, but at some level, we didn't have deposit insurance, we
Right.
didn't have, the whole concept of government stimulus wasn't even coined or invented. It was really in response to the events of 1929 that John Maynard Keynes wrote treatise on money, I think,
Yes.
and then wrote the general theory much later in 1936. But at some level, a lot of the sort of things that we're talking about today, in terms of policy responses or deposit insurance didn't exist at all, but were created sort of in response to that. So I'm just curious, like, reading the book, I mean, what did you learn sort of about policy and how it's been shaped by these events as well?
Well. So just for those folks who are listening to us, the book is not just about the crash of 1929. It really is the period of, call it the beginning of 1929 through 1933, which to me is the sort of full arc of the story. The crash of 29 was really just the first domino in a series of dominoes that ultimately were oftentimes political policy choices um, that led to the Great Depression. It wasn't preordained that what happened in 1929 had to lead to 25% unemployment by the time we got to 1932. It's that we had a crash in October of 1929. By the way, by the end of 1929, by the end of the year, market was only down 17%. People forget that. It had gone down, basically, it was down 50% by November 13th, and then actually started to go up again. The problem was so many people had bought on margin. People were going into these brokerages, putting down $1. They were getting loans for $10. It's 10 to 1. And so all of a sudden, the downdraft, just there were so many margin calls and people were losing their homes. And that was really the first domino of just the confidence that got sucked out of the system. But then it was the series of policy choices after that, everything from the tariffs, Smoot-Hawley tariffs in 1930. I mean, go back and think about Hoover. Hoover wanted to win over America, the election in 1928. He was trying to tell farmers, if you elect me, I'll put these tariffs in place. And so he wanted to make good on his pledge, even though everybody was telling him in 1930, the economy is, teetering and this is a terrible idea. He does it anyway. The Federal Reserve basically doesn't do anything. They sit on their hands for most of the time. At one point, Hoover's trying to raise taxes, which is probably not a great idea in during all of this. So there were a couple of things that were happening, and you're right. There were no insider trading laws. There was no SEC. There was no deposit insurance. There was a big debate about, how do you backstop the banks when they started to tumble? You know, Do you want to throw money at the problem? I think that's one of the lessons we actually learned at Keynes, 1930, that you have to throw money at the problem. But guess what? We had a gold standard back then. So it wasn't like we could print money willy-nilly left and right. And so there was a big debate about that was taking place during that period. By the way, there was no capital requirements for the banks during any of this. I mean, the Bank Act, 1940. So there were so many pieces of the puzzle that really did come afterwards. And I think we learned from that. And for the most part, even though I know we've had other crises, including 2008, I think there have been a lot of lessons. And I like to believe, people always say, could we have another 1929? I would say, could we? We could. But by the way, 1929 doesn't have to result in 1932.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. When you're talking about putting $1 down and taking $10 of leverage, I'm starting to think about zero-day options and some of the things that are going on now.
Well, there are, by the way, some of that does exist both in the options market, some in the crypto, some of the unregulated crypto space. I mean, some of this does parallel.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, in just in going through, I guess, some of these topics, it's like we had, obviously Carter Glass-Steagall. That was another thing. Separation of investment banking and commercial banking. I guess it wasn't obviously Roosevelt coming in 1932 sort of is a watershed moment. I'm just curious about that election in particular. Like, what were the things that you sort of learned in that period about the policies and sort of the push, I guess, for what became the New Deal?
Well,
What were the things
there's,
that
I think
you learned about that?
the biggest thing I learned, I had an impression, as I imagine many Americans do, that Hoover lost the election to Roosevelt because of the economy, that people believed that this depression was terrible and they hated Hoover and you'd blame Hoover for it. We always say that the electorate, votes with their wallet. If
Hmm.
you go back and look at the polling at the time, two things are happening. One is the market was actually going up. It appeared to people, they thought the economy was getting better during the election of 1928. I'm sorry, of 1932. And uniquely, the pivotal sort of voting issue at that moment was actually prohibition.
Wow.
And it appears that Hoover lost in large part because he supported prohibition more than anything else. So he loses, and really within a month of him losing, a lot of the banks start to get into a lot of trouble, and he sees that. And he is starting to think, okay, we really need to backstop these banks somehow. And he talked about trying to use presidential powers to do that, but he thought that he couldn't do that without the support of Roosevelt, who had now just won. And because he's a lame duck, he's thinking, I can't do this. And if I announce some plan to support the banks without Roosevelt also supporting the banks, or at least his some kind of acceptance that this is the sort of long-term plan, people won't buy it. And so Hoover secretly goes to Roosevelt and says, "Hey, man, we got to do this together because otherwise we're going to have a problem." And Roosevelt basically says, "Talk to the hand. Like, I'm not taking this on, and I'm not saying yes to this," because he didn't want to get tagged. If it didn't work, he didn't want to get tagged with it. He wanted to start afresh. And in fact, he kind of lied to Hoover and said he would never do anything like that. And of course, 2 days later, after winning, he does exactly that and closes down the banks and then supports them and everything else. So, you know, it was a very just sort of interesting moment to sort of watch the transition of presidential power in this particular case was very important. And actually, I oftentimes in my mind go back and think about Too Big to Fail, and I juxtapose the transition between Bush and Obama, actually, and TARP and all the things that were taking place in the fall of 2008, and actually how well they worked together. And I think that's one of the reasons that we got to the other side as quickly as we did.
Yeah, I remember watching, I think it was some financial crisis anniversary type event where they interviewed George W. Bush, and he, in reflecting on the events of the 2008 global financial crisis, basically said that going through his mind and himself being a student of history, that he didn't want to be a Herbert Hoover, that they didn't want to sort of commit the same mistakes. And so I think And I think he very much leaned on making sure that they were with TARP and I mean later the Obama administration passed the stimulus bill and that they were very much on the same team. So yeah, it's amazing how I think at some level that moment there in 19 33 really set the course for all these things and that we have today. And obviously there was a lot more that came after that, Social Security, I think 1935 and then sort of the rest of the sort of New Deal. But it's a fascinating period, and I guess I'm curious, like, and we also, certainly when we were going through the global financial crisis, we heard a lot about Glass-Steagall and separation of commercial banking, investment banking. I feel like for a long time, one sort of thing that's been pitched and still pitched, I think, by Senator Elizabeth Warren when she's on Squawk Box and
Yep.
elsewhere. Is that we need to bring back Glass-Steagall, but these were Glass and Steagall were characters in some of their characters in your book. I'm just curious, what did you learn about them and Congress and the role that they played in all this?
Well, so one of the main reasons I actually wanted to write this book was because of Carter Glass, the character of Carter Glass, which I had never really spent extraordinary amounts of time trying to understand or examine. And it wasn't until I really went back and understood his own story. And by the way, he really was sort of the Elizabeth Warren of his time. And during much of the 20s, late 20s, he used to rail about this thing called Mitchellism, as in Charlie Mitchell, the guy who was running National City. He believed that by Charlie Mitchell loaning all this money to folks, that it was going to cause the speculative fervor and it was going to upend America. And what I remember thinking was, oh goodness, now there's a spine of a story because there's two characters that are sort of going at each other. Charlie Mitchell on one side, Carter Glass on the other, and this goes on for years. And of course, without giving it away, Charlie Mitchell gets in all sorts of trouble, including, by the way, getting arrested at his own home. And Carter Glass ends up obviously creating the Glass-Steagall bill. But the other thing that was really a fascinating lesson to me is Elizabeth Warren and others today, I think all point to Glass-Steagall as this sort of significant historical bill that's pure, that was based on really this idea of breaking up the banks because they needed to be broken up and because this was done for all the right reasons. But when you get behind the story, you realize actually that part of the bill wasn't even written by Carter Glass. It was actually written, I mean, literally physically written by a banker who was trying to screw over another banker at JP Morgan. And that all of the sort of lobbying and things that go on in Washington today were going on then. I used to have this sort of, you think, oh, the good old days. There was no money or influence back then. It was all the same. In fact, if you really read Glass-Steagall and understand how Glass-Steagall was created, part of it was created by the Rockefellers, effectively, to screw over JP Morgan. That's what it was. By the way,
Wow.
with the, not just implicit, with the explicit help of Roosevelt.
Wow. That's fascinating. I mean, today I feel like something like that almost couldn't happen in the sense that like that you've got lobbies. I mean, obviously there is activity that goes on, but I feel like the lobbying from the banks is so much more organized. I mean, what was exactly the J.P. Morgan or James Pierpont Morgan's response to all this? I mean, I guess the Rockefellers they had their own oil dynasty and they had Standard Oil. I mean, which obviously got broken up later too, or had already been broken up. I mean, what was the response from the House of J.P. Morgan at that point?
Well, so what was happening was the son-in-law of the Rockefellers was running Chase, the bank Chase, which was owned by the Rockefellers. And they really wanted JP Morgan to get broken up more than anything, so that they wouldn't have the investment banking and the commercial banking piece together because they thought that was competitively going to hurt Chase. I mean, that's what was going on. And so you had Aldrich, who was one of the Rockefellers, effectively going to Roosevelt and saying, "We need to do this, and this is why." And he gave reasons that weren't about screwing up J.P. Morgan, but that was behind the scenes what was really happening. And then you had Thomas Lamont, who would get meetings with Roosevelt and who'd be in the Oval Office saying to Roosevelt, we don't need this. This is too much. You're going too far. It's going to mess things up. And he would, you could see both of them literally lobbying the president. I mean, it's interesting today. People think that CEOs spending time in the Oval Office is unique under Trump, but not that different than what was happening back in the 1930s.
Absolutely. And I guess like, a lot of other investment banks, Goldman Sachs was still nascent, maybe a commercial paper company. But I remember, when I was working at Goldman Sachs, hearing a lot of these stories about Sidney Weinberg and his relationship with Roosevelt. But yeah, I mean, at the time too, I'm sure just the power across industries was so different. As of 1950, it's like the richest metropolitan area in America was Detroit, and this was very much at this time, certainly in the 1930s. The auto industry was just starting to take off really, and I'm sure at some level, the banks weren't maybe even as totally powerful as certain banks might not have been as powerful at the time. So you could imagine like an oil dynasty, and it's also banking. I mean, some banking interests might have some power and be able to fight against the banks. I mean, I mean, even now I feel like maybe around the time of the global financial crisis, the banking lobby felt very strong, but just even today, in sort of 15 years later, I feel like the tech industry, they're lobbying, the crypto industry, they're lobbying. And you can see this right now, like playing out with like, stablecoin regulation,
Totally.
whether stablecoins to offer the yield or not. The banks obviously don't want stablecoins to offer yield. For obviously the stablecoins and the crypto industry does. And so, I mean, that's going on right now in terms of, the banking industry like wrote the line in the Genius Act, preventing the stablecoins from offering any kind of yield for regulated stablecoins. But I mean, these dynamics are super fascinating, to say the least.
It's all repeating in its own way. That's the fun part about life is if it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So
Absolutely. So I'm just curious, like in terms of other particular players that you think were interesting, and what would like I guess like in terms of
well, do you want to
range.
laugh? If you want to laugh, I'll
Yes,
give you one of
absolutely. Would love that.
my one of my favorites is a character named Evangeline Adams. Evangeline Adams was an astrologer based in New York, who had an office in Carnegie Hall, and every banker, including J. Pierpont Morgan, was a client, and they would go visit her to figure out what she thought was going to happen to the stock market. Literally, she had a newsletter back then with 100,000 subscribers. I mean, it was bigger than DealBook on a if you think about what it was at that time. And people would pay her $50 an hour to come visit with her, like she was a psychiatrist, to tell you what was in the stars. And that's what was happening. I mean, she was such an extraordinary sort of character. I mean, a true character of characters during that period. And I couldn't believe it. When I remember somebody told me about her, and I sort of laughed. I thought, oh, that's got to be like a side thing. And then I find out that like all these real people are going to ask her what's happening to the stock market. And then, by the way, they're trading based on what she's telling them.
It's wild. My goodness. Crazy to least. I mean, lots of people, I guess there's lots of all sorts of crazy, stock tips that I think of over the years, and all these folks. But I mean, an astrologer that's a first. I guess I want to just maybe get into a little bit on sort of the bank run
Hmm.
side of things, because in 2008 we hadn't really seen bank runs in a long time in the U.S. and arguably 2008 was a run on money markets, and those are not the kind of run that you're used to seeing. But even just a few years ago with Silicon Valley Bank, it was very much a run conducted by people withdrawing funds through their phone overnight. And so but what makes this, I think, some of these photographs just so memorable is that you had people waiting in line to get their money out of the bank. For those that are watching, it's a Wonderful Life, which isn't, I don't think it's a bank. I think it's like an SNL or something like that.
Hmm. Right.
But that George Bailey kind of bank run kind of scenario. I'm just curious about some of the stories that you read, about that. I mean, obviously, if you're a household, a mom and pop household, and you can't get money in the bank, it's pretty frightening. But I'm just curious about like the psychology that created at the time, that the bank runs themselves, as well as obviously the massive stock market decline. Like, I don't think at that
Right.
time you didn't have tons of savings, in the way that you do in a robust way with 401ks and IRAs and stuff like that. So I imagine that like the fraction of Americans at the time that actually owned stocks was probably somewhat, it was much smaller than it is today.
Oh, meaningfully smaller, but in terms of the psychological impact, I think it was extraordinary. And I was struck. You famously always see these. You were talking about the pictures of people, around a bank, and of course, one of the first bank runs during this period was the United States, the Bank of the United States, which of course unrelated to the government, but that was the name of the bank. It was in New York where it happened, and it happened because of a bad rumor. But I was struck the famous pictures that we all see down at the New York Stock Exchange in 1929. We see all these pictures of like thousands of people standing outside the exchange.
Hmm.
I don't think I ever really understood what they were doing there until I worked on this book, which was they'd all, so many people, not just from New York, but from around the world, around the country, were coming down to the exchange during those terrible days to try to find out what was happening to their money. I mean, like literally, and this is sort of a technology story in a way, because the stock market itself was so off in terms of the prices that you'd see even on the big board compared to what was actually happening in reality. Sometimes they were 3, 4, 5, 7 hours behind. And it would be like a server today glitching out, basically. But back then, so much trading volume was pouring through the system, and literally the system couldn't keep up. And so people were hearing rumors, parts of the city, part of the country, about what the stock prices were. They didn't know, so they literally physically came there, like to stand outside and try to talk to people to find out, could they sell their stocks and what were they going to do? And I mean, talk about a run on the bank. It was actually the sort of ultimate run on the bank. And I've always thought that the technology issue, in part, actually really helped the crisis get so much worse because people just almost decided, what, I'm just going to sell indiscriminately. I don't care because I just don't really understand what's even happening anymore. The other thing I was going to mention about the sort of psychological impact of all this is, and I don't say this in the book, because it's not really a personal story in the book, but my grandfather was a messenger boy with his brother down there during this period of time. And he was, I think his brother was a 16, he was like 11 or 12 years old. And he used to tell a story about watching somebody jump out of a window after all this happened.
Yeah.
And as a result, my grandfather, he lived till he was 91, 92 years old. He never bought one share of stock his whole life. He bought bonds, bought real estate, never stock. And so I do think there was that whole period of time for a generation of people, they were worried about, whether the money they were keeping at the bank was actually going to really be there when it was all over. They were worried about whether the stock market was rigged against them. By the way, back in 1929, there was no insider trading rules. In some cases, it was being rigged against them. And so there were so many sort of psychological impacts that I think impacted Americans that wasn't just about 1930 or 32 or 30, that lasted, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in my case, my grandfather, into the 90s and aughts.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, some of these, jobs that exist, that don't exist anymore. I met there was this guy named Al Feld. He's a private wealth advisor at Goldman Sachs for I think like 75 years or something like that. He got his first job at Goldman in like the 30s. I think his first job was like he was like a wheelbarrow boy for the paper stock certificates or something like that. And it's amazing. Like now today, obviously, we have instantaneous information, but back then, it's like your stock was an actual stock certificate, and prices were delayed, and there was all these, it took time to actually figure out what was going on. It just, technologically things were so different.
And that's, by the way, one reason why I like to believe that things are better today is actually the technology is so much better that you can actually look at it by the millisecond on the telephone. Now, at the same time, you could argue that a bad rumor can spread much more quickly, even more broadly. But I also would think that a bad rumor could be squashed that much more quickly too, in terms of just the efficiency of it. But you know, I remember when I was writing this book, there was a moment, 2021, where the whole GameStop phenomenon and AMC was happening, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, this also is like 1929 in
Oh,
certain ways, and people are, you know, talking up stocks, golden, you know, diamond hands, and this and that. And no, I mean that's
yeah.
really what was happening. And I wonder whether the technology, while the technology is better, I also wonder whether it could make a crisis better in the future or worse in the future. And I'm not sure I know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at some level, you still got psychology, behind these things. I don't think, it's not like every trader is an algorithmic trader. And even the algorithms, sometimes are not programmed appropriately to deal with, certain sorts of stock market swings. And I think that's, part of what happened. I don't think they were expecting some sort of a short squeeze, retail event to happen. And, maybe the algorithms are now, better equipped to deal with that, and why we haven't seen much too much since the AMC and the GameStop pumps. But yeah, I mean it's super fascinating to say the least. And I think 1987 sort of gets, I guess, a similar sort of people are still trying to figure out what exactly happened then,
Right?
when the stock market fell by 25% a single day. And I know people, even to this day, who are working, at Goldman Sachs. For an example, one person who I know, like, doesn't want to manage money because they saw someone jump off a building in 1987, and then they are doing
Yeah.
other things in finance, but they didn't want to invest because of that event in particular. So I mean the psychological effects of these things have very, very long lasting effects. And so it's but
Look, one of the main characters of the book is a short seller, famous short seller. A lot of people in Wall Street know him, Jesse Livermore, during that period. But Jesse Livermore was an emotional wreck of a guy. He was very successful in 1929, made a fortune, and made about $100 million. But he was so obsessed with trading that he made the fortune, he lost the fortune, he made it back, he lost it. He ultimately literally shoots himself in the head in 1940. And so I think it can the emotional, psychological impact of this market is a real thing for some people.
Yeah. So, just came back to the, policy angle, and looking across both, too big to fail, 1929. I mean, is there a lesson or a set of lessons that you think policymakers and people in financial
Right.
markets still haven't, like, fully absorbed from these events?
Well, I think they've absorbed some of them, and then we forget some of them. I think the biggest is that debt really is the match that lights the fire of every crisis, every systemic crisis. That just is a truth, and we should just stipulate that at the top. I think people do forget that also every single time. It was margin debt in 2000, in 1929. Obviously, it was subprime debt in 2008. And I think so we always have to watch the debt levels. That to me is a huge, huge piece of it. The other thing is you need transparency, you need disclosure. I think in a lot of the cases back in 1929, there was a lot of manipulation and other things going on. I think 2008, I think there was some manipulation going on. People didn't understand exactly what was happening. And so every time new financial products sort of come to the fore, we need to be careful about what the guardrails are around them. And then the last thing I'd say is, and those things are basically to try to avoid a crash or crisis on the front end. I think the last thing and I think we have learned our lesson. Ben Bernanke, I think, demonstrated the lesson because he did his PhD on this period of 1929, the Great Depression, is that when you have a crash and you have a crisis, you need to throw money at the problem. Like that is the lesson. That is the playbook. And I think we've shown that that playbook works. 2008, it worked. By the way, we did the same thing for a hot minute during the pandemic, and that worked as well. Having said that, the one piece of this that I worry about is we've told ourselves that when there's a crash or a crisis, we throw money at the problem to create sort of a put on the market, and that works. But back in 1929, there was a budget surplus in America. Today, we're living with $38 trillion of debt in America, and I've always thought there'd be some invisible line that we just can't go over that would turn into a red line. And that actually could bring you back to a 1929 or 1932 like moment where at some point, Congress and the Fed and everybody else says, we're going to spend another 5 trillion or 10 trillion. The things have gotten so bad, we need to deal with it. And we've done in the past, we'll do it again. But at some point, the bond market raises their hand and says, we can't do it this way anymore. And then you get into some kind of austerity trap, and then you really get in trouble. I don't know. And that to me is the big question.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago or 15 years ago or so, Reinhard Rogoff had this sort of 90% debt to GDP threshold that they found. And, it's descriptive data and, there's only so much you can do with it. But, the idea is that after you pass 90% of debt to GDP or so, that, economic growth is usually much lower. And so, yeah, we'll see. I mean, given that we've passed that threshold, but I think I'm in complete agreement with you that the lender of last resort powers, I think, are super important, much more so than I think quantitative easing. I think it's sort of had a mixed track record as a growth strategy. Think of Europe and Japan and the Bank of England. They've all done as much or more QE as the U.S. as a fraction of GDP, and yet their GDP per capita has been pretty flat, and their stock markets have been comparatively flat compared to the U.S. And I think the U.S. story is really that of technology, and it's something that's been very unique. And it's been driving a lot of stock market returns in the past 15 years or so. But when it comes to those crises, following Badger's dictum, lending freely at a penalty rate, against good collateral, that's kind of the key. And I think that's
Yep.
the lesson the key lesson that I think we've learned from 1929 that I think we're now following in good stead. So I think maybe that's one of the great lessons that the policymakers seem to have absorbed here. Andrew, it's been a real honor to have you on and talking about your amazing career in journalism, New York Times and CNBC, and your two fantastic books. Definitely recommend to our listeners to read both 1929 and Too Big to Fail. They truly are, I think, the two definitive accounts of the two worst financial crises in American history. So it's a real honor to have you
Thank
on
you.
and talk to you about these books.
This was a privilege to be with you, and what a great conversation. Thank you.
This is the Capitalism and Freedom, the 21st Century podcast, an official podcast of the Hoover Institution Economic Policy Working Group, where we talk about economics, markets, and public policy. I'm Jon Hartley, your host. Thanks so much for joining us.